Right. So, we are a not-for-profit organization which provides primarily a platform for engineers to interact, meet each other, hold discussions, uh, have interactions on a regular basis, primarily aimed for overall elevation of the engineering fraternity and help each other primarily. Uh, as Mumbai Local Network, we conduct various activities. A snapshot of activities is available to you on the screen. We work with younger professionals, graduate undergraduate members, academicians, with industries, with professionals from various sectors. And as you see, we conduct events including industry visits, hackathons, around subject and topics of interest to our members. Um, so we help to promote engineering, we help to promote and support various activities within engineering and try to explore ways and means in which we can actually connect with academicians, bridge the gap between academics and industry, and also support industries across India. So various activities that you see on the screen that Mumbai Local Network has been conducting are primarily aimed at overall elevation of the engineering fraternity itself. So if you're interested to know more about the activities of IIT, feel free to connect with me and I will be more than happy to help. I was on a conference call just a couple of days back. Everyone is, as we know, is affected by something that human beings are not even able to see. The whole globe, the whole industry is actually at a standstill right now. Countries like India are having major lockdowns for the last 3 weeks, and we are into another 3 weeks of lockdown further. One discussion I heard recently at a conference was somebody shared his experience from another conference, and he said that one of the questions that was asked at the conference was, "What is driving? What is driving digitalization in your companies?" So the choices given were A. Is it the chief technology officer? B. Is it the chief information officer? Or is it coronavirus? And I think everybody mentioned it is probably coronavirus which is driving us to embrace digitalization, which essentially brings us to a very pertinent question over here. Um, is the industry probably doing enough when it comes to embracing change, embracing innovation? And I think around those kinds of concepts, I thought probably getting somebody like Kaustup to talk over here, who is an evangelist, he's an innovator, and has been associated with various companies, um, uh, actually can help us understand whether there is more for companies to do and achieve through innovation. So that's essentially what we are going to talk about. That's essentially what we're going to hear about from Kaustup, and I'm quite glad that he agreed to be a part of this IC Genesis and the IET Tech Dice event today. Uh, so just before we start, a humble request: please mute your microphones and switch off your cameras, video cameras, so that we are able to hear the speaker a bit more clearly, and there is not much disturbance for everybody else. So with that brief introduction, let me call upon Kaustubh to share his screen. And Kaustubh, if you can unmute yourself and share your screen, let's hear from you. Thank you very much.
Hello. First of all, can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you all see me, hear me? Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
All right,
Yes.
because that's the first question that nowadays has become the norm. Am I audible? Am I visible? So, yeah. First of all, thank you very much, ICE and Rajesh, for having me over for this talk. Hope all of you are safe and healthy at home. And I was told in the discussions leading to this session that most of the audience would be from a project management background. So I will try to stay within that domain and maybe not digress too much beyond that. So, In addition to large companies, I am associated with a lot of incubators, startup incubators. And just yesterday, I was talking to one mentee, so to say, one startup. And the kind of undercurrent that I got from his statements was, oh, this is maybe in 3 months, we will be back to normal. And I will recreate the model which I was following till February. Well, that's definitely not going to happen. And this, as everybody is saying, that the normal had shifted, and we really need to adopt to that. Getting used to this lockdown, a lot of our habits will change, have changed. Companies will have discovered different ways of working, and a lot of products and services might just not be needed in the present form once we come out of this COVID era, COVID times. So at least the way we knew the normal, that had changed for sure. So what is basically happening is, can I share my PowerPoint, Rajesh? Share. Okay.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So can you see this thing?
Yeah, it's just come up. Maybe you can just start the slideshow. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that looks fine.
So okay. So basically, existing supply chains have broken down. Some kind of beyond repair. Customers are not paying because they are not getting paid. So do we really continue to sell what we make, or we make what might sell? Is the kind of question that probably everybody is grappling with. Now, coming to that, what I will kind of restrict this session to is, one is how do we reimagine the business models? How do we reach out to customers? And then I'll talk a little bit about some kind of disruptions in technology that I feel are happening and will happen. So all of us are facing a cash-strapped consumer, which is a fact now. So how do we now recreate, what we do? So Uberization of industrial assets is the key way forward. Lot of people, lot of pieces in that supply chain are lying idle. So how do we create, creative collaborations to utilize these idle assets? So some kind of discussion has to happen around that. The way Uber identified the fleet rentals being idle for 40 to 45% of the time, and then they created a platform to kind of help utilize that idle capacity and offer the consumer a much lower rate. So that's that. That's something will have to happen to the industrial asset space also. Then the second point is about fractional ownership models will have to emerge. When we are trying to sell stuff to people, maybe expensive stuff, how can we recreate these fractional ownership models? For example, there was this company called NetJets, which used to sell private aircrafts. And private aircrafts are bought by real super rich people. And they hit a kind of a glass ceiling at one point, wherein how many really super rich people, super say, super into 10 raised to 10 into rich variety exist in the world. So they were not growing the way they would have wanted to. And that's when they did a little bit of user research and figured out that below that super into 10 raised to 10 into rich variety, there is a super into 10 raised to 7 into rich variety also, which needs those products, which needs a private aircraft. They are also extremely busy. But at the same time, they do not have the cash flow to buy an aircraft of their own. Say maybe they can't really shell out 250, 300 crores from their cash flow and buy a private aircraft. So how did this NetJets approach that new space? They introduced a fractional ownership model where they started selling the aircraft to a group of 5 or 6 people. And that's how the airtime was distributed amongst those people in the percentage of the ownership. That's what emerged as fractional ownership quite a long time back. So that's something which we'll have to really look at in this new scenario. We have to make it more more available for a lot of other resources as well, not just expensive products or services. A cash-strapped customer will appreciate a lot of unbundling of accessories. So we'll have to really, the customer is going to be really picky and choosy about what he needs and what he doesn't need. So we will have to create offerings which are unbundled. Projects will have to be really looking at this aspect as such. And lastly, pay as you use will become the norm. Pay as you use, there are some examples which I will talk about. Is, for example, this Goodyear tires, for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, they've been trying to bring in a model where you don't buy a full tire, you pay an upfront amount, say out of maybe a tire costing 10,000 rupees, you pay 2,000 rupees, and the remaining 8,000 you don't pay at that time. But with sensors, etc., embedded in the vehicle and in the tire, the usage of the tire gets captured on the cloud, and you are charged as pay per mile, so to say. And pay per mile also depends on the kind of usage the tire undergoes. Suppose the car is being driven on a smooth expressway, you get charged, say, 20 cents per mile. Whereas if the car is being driven on a tough country road, you get charged maybe 25 or 30 cents per mile. So those kinds of things will have to come in. And technology today, this technology is already available, but we need to really identify various use cases at a mass scale, at different levels. We have to imagine these kinds of use cases and adopt this kind of a model. Now that brings me to another side of the whole thing, which is, how now when pay as you use comes in, many a time the provider of the service is worried that we will lose out on revenue, or we will have to really cut down costs and things like that. But at the same time, the risk for the provider also gets distributed. Let me take an example. This is also about 2.5 years back. I was doing a program with an insurance company, and we were really looking at how we can come up with some differentiators in the market. And this had come up at that time, where suppose today, two of us, a person A and person B, buys an insurance policy of the same amount on the same day, say a 50 lakh policy, life insurance policy. So the company tells them to take a medical test, etc., etc., etc. And coincidentally, the parameters of both the people, A and B, happen to be the same. So the company decides a uniform premium for both of them. Now suppose, imagine both their blood sugar levels were identical on the day of the test. And say tomorrow onwards, so both of them have a fixed premium and they pay that fixed premium annually. Now tomorrow onwards, imagine person A is a very therapy compliant, diet compliant individual, whereas a person B is not, is kind of doesn't really comply with therapy, doesn't really comply with the dietary restrictions, etc. So that fellow's blood sugar keeps on varying up and down. And but at the end of the year, both of them pay the same premium. Is that a fair model? Definitely not. So what was being talked about at that time was we suggested that, if there is a policy which is sold, which is beyond a certain amount, say 50 lakh plus or something, the insurance company could give a wearable device to each customer and capture all these readings in real time, would be fed in the cloud. And the insurance company would have an algorithm which actually calculates the risk of person A against person B, and accordingly keeps the premium variable. At the end of the year, suppose person A is compliant, he pays less premium. Person B is not compliant, his medical parameters vary, he pays a higher premium. Now, this kind of a idea, this kind of a concept is actually a real win-win situation for everyone in that whole process, because person A who complies gets the benefit. Person B who doesn't comply actually gets an alert notification that please start complying with the therapy, and is actually incentivized to meet the therapy, etc. And the company's risk profile reduces for the entire insurance product. So these are kind of win-win situations that one really will have to visualize, imagine in these coming scenarios. So from both the customer benefit side and the company benefit side also, both have to be balanced. And these are the kinds of use cases we'll have to imagine. And in your projects, whatever you're managing, so think about how you could bring in these pay-per-use models, pay as you use, not pay-per-use, but pay as you use kind of models, and get benefits, give benefits to the customer, as well as reduce your risks in the whole process. So those kinds of imaginative use cases we'll have to think of. Now that brings me to the how of it. So I feel there is something, a term that I often use is what is called as a last mile user connect. We need to really develop that last mile user connect with the end user as to how is that product or service being used, going to be used, what are the touch points of the interactions, etc. And let me take an example. I kind of firmly believe that the user first, technology later approach really, really works, because that's when really good products and really good services come out. Let me take an example. This is somewhere around 2018 beginning. I was doing a project with a usual telecalling company, which kind of pesters us with those calls of trying to sell a credit card or an auto loan or a home loan, etc., etc., etc. And we keep saying, we keep disconnecting, but still they keep calling us. Now, this company came saying that we would like to enhance the efficiency of our various processes. So my first question was, which is the most inefficient process in the whole organization? They said the calling process. Then let us target on that. So we began with a small project team of about 15, 16 of them. And initially, it was kind of from their side, they were saying that we will only have GM and VPs in the whole conversation. But I kind of insisted that, let us have the entire team which is actually involved in the whole process. So after some iterations, we finally came to a conclusion that we will also include 2 telecallers in this workshop. People who actually pick up the receiver and talk to customers, because they are that last point, touch point with the customer, and that's where real things will come out from. So this brainstorming session, we had a 2-day session, began. In the first 1.5 hours, I noticed that these 2 telecallers never spoke a word. They were probably overwhelmed in that whole setting, with all their seniors involved. So there were some VPs, there were some solution architects, there were techies, and these 2 telecallers were also there. So during the coffee break, I kind of went and sat with these people and tried to make them talk, because they hadn't spoken a word in that whole conversation. And while they opened up, one of them very matter-of-factly, casually said that all this discussion that is happening is great. Everybody was talking about quality of service goals and multiple, parameters, X, Y, Z, all kinds of things. This guy very casually mentioned that, sir, when I pick up the receiver and talk to a prospect, within the first 5 to 6 sentences that the prospect utters, from the voice tone, I can kind of get a feeling that this call is going to get converted, this customer is going to listen to me, not listen to me, etc., etc., etc. Now that was an interesting, observation, insight, whatever you call it. It appealed to me a lot. So when we restarted the conversation after the coffee break, I kind of broached that topic, and I made this person, this telecaller, talk about his experience, his whatever he had mentioned in that break. And when he said that, that voice tone subjective parameter is what gives me an inkling, most of the senior folks jumped on us saying that we have 3,500 callers making 50 to 60 calls in an 8-hour shift, which means we have something like 175,000 to 2 lakh calls per shift. And if each call's subjective judgment were to be taken into account, it's impossible to operate at scale. Now that's where a lot of us as project managers face that scale issue. Customization versus scale. Now, a very valid objection, but we didn't give up. We kept on talking about it, and in another 10 or 15 minutes of this conversation, one of the techies said that, what is voice tone? Voice tone is actually a sound wave, and a sound wave has amplitude, has wavelength, and has frequency. And all these three are perfectly measurable. So what is the problem? So if voice tone can be broken down into these three parameters, it will be measurable. Then it is a question of finding a large enough data set to kind of quantify the whole thing. Then the next question was, how many calls do you have recorded? Because remember, every time these people call us, they ask us, this call is going to be recorded for quality and training purposes, which means they have a recording. So this question, a little bit of checking up at the back end, they told us that 45 lakh call logs had been recorded over the previous 8 to 10 years of operation. 45 lakh call logs, that is 4.5 million call logs, is a large database. And then the next question from my side was, are the results of these calls also documented? We meticulously document those also. That means this call took 10 calls to convert. This call took 15, this prospect took 15 calls to convert. This one got converted to 5, this never got converted, etc., etc., etc. So then it is a question of pattern recognition and speech recognition for the voice tonality. So then we connected with some startup from one of these incubators who was doing some cool stuff in that speech recognition space. And that startup and this company got together, and it took about 7 to 8 months for them to create a voice engine, which, when correlated with the outcomes of those 4.5 million call logs, what came out was that these 4.5 million call logs fell into 5 patterns. Say, voice tone pattern A corresponded to an outright conversion of the prospect, outright yes. Voice tone pattern B converted to maybe yes. Voice tone pattern C corresponded to maybe yes, no, fringe customer. Voice tone pattern D, maybe no, and voice tone pattern E is an outright no. Now, with this, a self-learning algorithm was created. And now they are at a stage where when a telecaller makes a call, within the first 12 words that the prospect utters, that prospect gets bucketed, that prospect's voice is analyzed by the back-end voice engine and get bucketed into one of these 5 patterns. And depending on which pattern that this prospect falls under, the conversation flow gets displayed in front of the telecaller screen. So that now the whole thing, time, effort, money required for the whole process has come down drastically. And this particular telecalling company now charges probably about 1.7 times what it used to charge per call as earlier. So now that leads me to this point of user first, technology later. This idea came not from an existing technology that they had, but it came from a sharp focus on the user. that last mile user connect, which those two telecallers brought into the whole problem solving exercise. So I feel that's something very, very important, and even more so now. It has always been important, but now with user habits changing because of this COVID uh, times, how do we really get into that user skin to understand user habits is something that we'll have to really look at. And how does one do that? So there is a simple kind of a tool from a designer's toolkit, which is called as a customer journey map. If I can share that PDF, it's a very simple tool. uh, how do I, yeah, sorry. uh, how do I get to the sharing screen back?
You need to stop sharing and then share the new file.
What can you see on screen now?
I can see the PPT file still.
The PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it has come. Stop sharing.
Yes.
Now can you give the sharing rights to me again, because I would like
to. It's still with you. You can just go back to share screen and share your PDF file.
Share the desktop and then you can show the video.
Yeah. No, it's not a video. It's now can you see the PDF? It's a very simple tool, very simple template.
Yeah, we can see the
journeys. Whatever the customer, whether it's a B2B customer or B2C customer, what are the tasks that they undergo while doing that particular activity, and within each task, what are the steps involved? Religiously, if one can map out these touch points at every step and the feelings that the user goes through, a lot of granularity will come into understanding user journeys. And when we can understand user journeys, we will be able to recreate our offerings. We might be able to featureize something better. We might be able to kind of, create some very different, so to say, offerings and different features. Now, if one can do this for the habits that people are developing now, during COVID and post-COVID, this is a constant. So we need to really set up a team which really is in deep connect with the user, your intermediate user as well as your end user. So that's what is going to be really a helpful tool there. And I will share with you a kind of a, can you see this mind map?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Over the last, say, 8-10 years, every project that I get involved with, certain new features keep coming in, and over the last 8-10 years, a kind of a framework has got built up, which lists out features, attributes of product services. Now, there are about 73 or 74 which have come up over the last so many years. And all of these may not be must-haves, but depending on the project that one is involved with, depending on the customer or the user that we are trying to solve a problem for, some of these can be picked up. So I will leave this on screen, and we will have a discussion on this before I get into the technology part of emerging technologies, etc. So, or should we leave this as a Q&A for later? What do you think?
Yeah, I think leaving it for Q&A later will be better, so that we can finish.
Maybe you can click a picture of this, have a look at it, and we will have some discussions on this later. But this, according to me, will be a useful framework for relooking at our offerings now, imagining new offerings by looking at some of the features which we don't have in our offerings. This can be used for benchmarking our current offering against our current competitors as well as recreating something new and keeping the customer requirement in sight at all times. So this I treat this as a cheat sheet to new product or service or system creation. So keep this with you, and we can have a Q&A later. Now let me go back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, so understanding user journeys is what we were talking about. Let's move on. So basically, all our systems have to have reconfigurability and modularity, because if the customer is going to ask us stripped down versions because of being cash strapped, etc., and if we have to meet requirements of different customers at a granular level, at a specific customizable level, our systems have to be reconfigurable and modular. Modular in the sense that we need to look at creating our systems which are plug and play, which can be reconfigured at the shortest notice. I take the principle of SMED, single minute exchange of dice from manufacturing, and we have to apply that into the systems that we create, the project management processes that we create. So these are two extremely important points which I feel going forward need to be really looked at. Now I'm going to talk about my understanding of the current scenario, especially in tackling the crisis. The government is acting. Government has resources, but not really great execution. Private sector also is trying to solve these issues coming up in this era, in these times. Private sector has execution, but somewhere they lack the trust factor with the people. And there are NGOs as the third end of the triad. They have trust, but really no scale. So how do we now create platforms which bridge these gaps? Government has resources, wants execution, but doesn't have execution. Private sector has execution, but no trust. NGOs have trust, but no scale. So how do we, people in this private sector, can kind of bridge these gaps in helping the government in execution as well as NGOs in scale? So those are the kinds of things that have to come into these large-scale projects that are being handled, that will come up post this era, be in healthcare, be in infrastructure, be it everywhere. So that's the thought that we really have to give to, I'll repeat at the cost of sounding repetitive, but how can we help government execute, and how can we help NGOs achieve scale? That's something that we really need to look at. I'll leave this point here. Now let's look at opportunities. I call this as the microscope moment of the 21st century. Microscope moment of the 21st century means 200 years back, when the microscope was invented, we got exposed to a whole new world of microorganisms which were never visible at that time. So if a person died of a disease, people would call it, God knows what happened to him or her, and maybe it was God's will, etc., etc., etc. But with the microscope coming in, we could find the causes of that disease. Now we are tackling an invisible enemy, which is this virus. And we have the technology of really high resolution cameras which go beyond microscopes. Now, what the need of the hour is non-contact testing at massive scales. Now, where is testing getting stuck? Because you need blood samples. Now, if you want to really do testing at massive scale, it has to be non-contact. Now, that could be done with high resolution cameras at public places, which are capable of possibly checking out the micro level organisms coming out of certain people's breath. Now, I'm just going wild on this, but that technology does exist. It might sound very expensive, but if there are people who are going to do some research in that, that's going to be the next scale of massive testing and non-contact testing at massive scales. So what I envisage is these high resolution cameras at public places, which actually look at the microorganisms in that space, are able to identify densities of microorganisms and which microorganisms are there, which will be that means the images captured from these cameras will probably sync with the cloud. The cloud will have data sets of images or DNA signatures, molecular signatures of these organisms, and the matching will be done in real time to be able to identify hotspots in a crowd, and segregation may happen. Now, there will be privacy issues, there will be a lot of things, etc., etc., etc. But to tackle such kinds of calamities at this scale, I think those issues will really have to be relooked at. That's something which I feel is the future in terms of some projects which can be taken up. People having this right technology should quickly get into this. Then the second point is wearables which are capable of checking new parameters. New parameters as in these pandemic, what are the symptoms of this coronavirus, etc., etc. Are wearables capable of capturing these features? So different kinds of sensors need to be coming into these wearables that could be synced with the cloud, and we could actually identify individual patients. Possibly, that's a possibility that might come up. The world has a shortage of 6 million nurses. About a week back, I read this. And now, how do you scale up that? Teaching through training institutions, etc., is out of question. So, virtual training at massive scales has to happen. AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality, beyond plain content has to come in. Now, when these nurses are going to be trained, it can't be just theoretical stuff. So 3D printed replicas of human anatomy and physiology will have to be created. And that opens up a massive, massive opportunity for people who have access to 3D, high resolution 3D printing, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, to this crowd, I don't really need to talk about the importance of 3D printing with the broken down supply chains. The importance of 3D printing is obvious to all of us. If we could have 3D printing will give a lot of control over manufacturing and will help us get out of that, supply chain constraints. Another thing that I see is, all touch-based products at public places in the long run will have to go non-contact. So they might become sound controlled or etc. It's speech controlled or whatever. Non-contact control has to come in. Now that will take some time. During that transition, these interfaces will have to be coated with some antibacterial, antiviral coatings. And today, silver-based nanotech coatings do that job quite efficiently. So those kinds of coatings, etc., for different bacteria, different viruses, etc., should come out, will come out in the short range, I feel. Before this really, these public interfaces go non-contact, which will take some time. Tourism might have to take the help of augmented reality, virtual reality. I think that's a no-brainer there. With people like us, middle-aged folks, sporting activity called off all over the world. And we have resisted this online gaming for a long time. The millennials are like constantly on their phones and stuff like that, playing. So gaming companies will probably have a market in us, because sporting activities which we used to watch are no longer happening. We are watching reruns of old events, etc. So maybe, our habits will get studied by these gaming companies, and possibly that's an opportunity that these gaming companies would be looking at. With this, I kind of will stop here, and we can take whatever questions, or we can open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kaustubh. That was pretty interesting. Some interesting insights on options available, areas where companies can think to deal with the current COVID-19 issues. The challenges that the government is facing. I think they're pretty aptly put over there, Kaustubh. Thanks a lot for that. You mentioned about a company where you gave this example about telecalling center and how you try to develop a voice pattern recognition system which actually enables them to identify which customers are likely to convert into real business opportunities. I'm quite, of course, telecalling is one sector probably where a lot of data is made available consistently. Can you share your insights about engineering industry in terms of data, availability of data? And when I say engineering, I'm talking more from services industry's perspective. So have you had any experience about how this really matters? Because inevitably the challenge sometimes is also even availability of data for some of these companies. So the starting point is probably very different for some of these enterprises. So any suggestions as to how that can change, and how that can be changed, and how that can be looked at by these companies and approached in a different fashion?
See, big data is everywhere. So is there really shortage of data? I don't think so. But as I said, we need to capture it from newer touch points, which, if you are in a service-based industry, people are accessing that service in probably different ways now than what they used to access maybe a month back. Now, we need to get into those points, the user journey map, which I talked about, those touch points, devices, interfaces, etc., which are probably changing for accessing that service. Now, how can we capture those points with maybe some sensors, IoT devices, etc.? Mobile phones, how creatively can we use mobile phones to capture these kinds of things? Would be something that I would really look at. That's how I think, from a service perspective, that's how I would look at it.
Right. Okay. So do you want to jump on to doing this exercise now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great.
So I've just displayed this sort of mind map in front. This is kind of a universal kind of, list of features, attributes. I'll leave it here, and we could maybe,
Sure. So do we have any questions online for Kaustubh over here? If you can just unmute yourself, you can directly ask the question, or feel free to type in your question into the chat box. Do we have any questions for Kaustubh?
Hi, this is Abhijit. Am I audible?
Yes, Abhijit, you are. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Kaustubh. This is Abhijit. I work for a engineering consulting firm. The question I have is, it's a fantastic talk. You opened up a lot of lateral thinking, or thinking out of box, what you can say, for a lot of people, including me. The question I have for you is, have you had chance to work with a consulting firm or a contracting firm in construction industry, and where, if you have, then where you see that going forward? especially the office spaces which people have been working with. Suddenly, previously had a sharing office, a shared office culture, or recent past they have opened up all this co-work and WeWork and all, right? Now, where you see that going, and how would that impact on the construction industry?
Office spaces, a lot of it is going to become redundant because people have discovered that taking that 1.5 hour commute to office was not really worth it till February, March. So that's going to be really challenging for these co-working spaces, office spaces, etc. For sure. Now, what happens to the existing construction that is already there, the inventory that is already there? Tough times, definitely for that space. But then, how does one really convert that space into, that idle asset into something utilizable? So let us look at where are the opportunities coming up for, I see that the well-oiled supply chain of the world over the last 30 years, everybody got used to JIT, just-in-time stuff. And just-in-time today is a big problem. People are not having stocks. So maybe warehousing space might have that opportunity coming up now, because people will realize that I used to work JIT, but at such times, JIT is not the right thing to happen. So can I keep some buffer stocks? So that will need real estate. So that's something which I feel if you are in the office space construction and if you are not already completed with your construction, then can you really relook at this? That's one ray of opportunity which I see there.
Sure. And Kaustubh, do you see that some of these real estate, especially properties or office spaces which have been developed in the last few years, what are the chances that they might actually be repurposed for things like, for example, hospitals? There's a dire need for hospitals. There's a dire need for having more beds and so on and so forth. So do you see that these opportunities will actually emerge, and hopefully a major challenge that India, for example, is facing in terms of having good quality hospitals available for the lower middle class and the lower class people as well on a mass scale? That can actually bring in these kind of options for government to actually start owning this, making, even for that matter, private sector players coming in a big way, owning these properties and repurposing them for such applications going forward.
Yeah, I feel so, because right now when we are dealing with this kind of disaster, people don't have places to operate from, which is happening, right? People are managing somehow or the other, even things like distributing food. It's being prepared somewhere, it's being gathered somewhere, it's being distributed somewhere else. So they need space, right? They need real estate. I mean, a very crude example, but then again, storing these healthcare equipments, because we're going to need that in massive quantities going forward. And if you really see this pandemic, modern pandemic era began from maybe 2000. So to say, I'm not going back to the Spanish flu and the etc. But last 20 years, if you really see, SARS came in, MERS came in, Ebola came in, Nipah came in, etc. And the gap between these two events is reducing. So I see these kinds of things happening cyclically, maybe every 2-3 years, possibly, because the gap is reducing between these events. So, and this has really been a kind of a paradigm shifting time, this COVID. So governments are also going to prepare their national disaster management mechanisms in a way, in a very different manner now, which will need real estate, which will need distributed disaster management control, spaces for stocking, for distribution of stuff, for manning operations, etc. So maybe if you're already you created some office spaces which are unlikely to get sold, maybe how can these be repurposed? That's where I'm talking about that triad between government, private sector, and NGOs. So we really need to look at this holistically and see what connections will emerge and how can we prepare for those.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. So I've got a question on the chat window over here from Gobindeep Singh, who's asking, are the business models you suggested relevant only to COVID-19 period, or can they be expanded into something much, much wider going forward?
I think that's the way going forward. With this COVID-19 will make us adopt these models. And when we realize the efficiencies of these models, we will obviously continue with it. So I mean, I don't think this is only restricted to this period. Because when we become more efficient in whatever we do, I mean, every day when I'm mopping the house, or not every day, whenever I find a more efficient ways of doing it. So I mean, I move on, right? So I don't think we are going to go back to old times. Social distancing is kind of here to stay for sure. So now cinema halls, when social distancing has to be maintained. So probably their revenue per square foot is going to drop. So they need to really find out ways and means to compensate for that loss of revenue. So they'll have to add some more services. They can't obviously raise the price of the ticket. They may to begin with, but people may not like it. People will just stick to Netflix and Prime, which we've already got used to in these last few weeks.
Yeah.
So they will have to add some different services. And that's where I'm saying that those touch points, with that user journey map template, which I talked about, that really needs to be dealt with in depth.
Right. And as an extension to the previous question, Gobindeep Singh is also asking, how could mechanical industry contribute to it, basically? In your, I don't know why by mechanical industry, what is it that he's actually specifically mentioning? But then he's saying, how could mechanical industry contribute to the business models that you mentioned about for the COVID-19 period?
Mechanical industry, I mean, engineering, manufacturing, I think that's what he seems to be referring to, right?
Possibly, yeah.
So, in fact, I feel because these global supply chains are no longer going to be reliable, so to say, because of what has happened now, people are going to actually try and manufacture stuff locally more than depending on the Chinese supply chain. So I feel that's an opportunity for the mechanical engineering domain, so to say. I'm not calling it an industry, but a lot of things will get localized.
Right, certainly.
I see that happening.
Definitely. So, I mean, just a reminder to everybody, people who want to ask questions, please unmute yourself and you can directly ask the question to the speaker over here, not a problem. So there's another question that Bhalchandar is asking, will there be hindrance to the startups' future mobility? I'm not quite sure what exactly the question is. Is it startups in future of mobility? Is that what is asked? I'm not quite sure. But I mean, considering that, going forward, Kaustubh, we are expecting the work from home likely to increase. Now we have government actually trying to build multiple metros across various cities and so on and so forth. Is this something that actually will change the pattern and change the government investments also going forward? Because probably people will less and less people will start commuting for their regular office work. In which case the investment pattern of government itself may actually change quite significantly. Is that how you see that transportation, especially the metro rail projects, that may actually take a little bit of a setback?
Let me just go back a little. Even in the private residential space, what I see is when people get used to working from home, people wouldn't mind staying further away into the suburbs. Am I audible?
You are audible. No issues.
So what I'm saying is, when people get more used to working from home, people wouldn't mind staying further away from their workplaces, which means for real estate guys, normally the city center used to be the premium higher rate per square footage. Maybe that might start reversing because demand in the suburbs will go up possibly when people get more comfortable working from home.
From home, yeah.
So that's something which I feel might happen. Uh, I really don't know, and I wish it happens.
Right,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah.
Now,
What was
there's
the
a
second part? Sorry, second part of your question,
yeah.
Rajesh.
So I think the person has Valchandra has clarified that people who are working on future of mobility, especially startups which are working on future of mobility, how does it impact them in your view going forward?
Startups working in the future of mobility, I would apply that thing of, uh, um, how can I unbundle the offering? So, for example, if you're selling an electric vehicle today, uh, say a 6 lakhs worth of Reva, out of that 6 lakhs, about 2.25 lakhs is the cost of the battery. Now, if I were to sell the vehicle without a battery and offer the battery as a service, in the sense that if I can offer 100 charges for 25,000 rupees or 30,000 rupees, if I can unbundle that offering, what happens is upfront cost to the customer comes down and the battery becomes like a subscription service. The company keeps making money over the lifespan of the battery. So a different kind of an infrastructure, which is actually emerging now also, that will have to be embraced in this mobility space. Plus modular batteries, which are being developed in Germany, a company called ET-Track. The way I see is now they do it only for bicycles and things like that. But they are doing R&D in the car battery space also. So the way I see it happening is instead of having a large battery in the car, there'll be a battery. There will be a series of batteries, and each of these batteries will be modular in nature. So if I have to go from Bombay to Pune, and my car's range is maybe 100 kilometers only electrical charging range, if I carry some 3-4 charged small modular batteries, as I go along, my dashboard tells me battery number 26 is down. I get down and change it and put that modular battery in. After another 50 kilometers, battery number 28 is down. I got down, So that's the kind of these kinds of models, and this is what I mean by modularity and unbundling of the offerings that I see. And it is a must. It has to happen. It
Right.
will.
Absolutely. Mandar, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. So Dr. Dhargalkar, very nice presentation. I like your last mile user connect. It's empathy for users. So I really appreciate that insights that you have given. My question is the new norm for is working from home, right? So the traffic on the road has gone down, but in traffic, internet traffic is up, right? So do you see any innovation coming in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's not. I mean, there is an old technology Microsoft used to use called folding, which utilizes our idle capacity of our machines, right? Of our machines, our computer, our laptop, our mobile phone, and I see that getting speeded up to be able to minimize the transmission bandwidth required. So that kind of shared memory of connected devices, which will help reduce the bandwidth requirement. That I think is going to get a real fillip. Now, privacy issues, etc., legal hassles will be there, but the push from the technology side will also push the legal side to take quicker decisions. The way vaccines, etc. Now a lot of these things, simulated testing, etc. What used to take probably 8 years for something to get launched, should happen in 1 or 2 years, for especially in these kinds of times, which is happening. So same thing will happen in this privacy space also. That's what I see as the bandwidth issue being tackled.
Right. Yeah. Srinivasa, you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
No, I already. Can you just read my? There's no
Yeah.
power.
No, please go ahead and ask a question. No issues. Okay. So Srinivasa has a question. How will retail supply chain be able to take up the disruptive level of home delivery orders, especially when people staying at home?
Retail you're talking about home delivery or the retail supply chain? Which part? Okay, let's look at home delivery, because I thought the import of that question was towards that. So
Yes.
I think in terms of what do you say, sanitized home delivery, that's something which will come in. So training of these delivery people, testing of these delivery people, etc., 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 will take a whole new dimension. The FSSAI will come in with a whole new set of guidelines to be adhered to for food items, processed food or delivery, etc. So I see a lot of policy things coming in there, and maybe audits, a whole mechanism of auditing this will possibly come in. And that's where I see a lot of IT companies taking that role in terms of the audits of these outlets, etc. So that's going to happen in that. That's the way I see it.
Great. And Kavish Shankar has a question for you. Trust building using blockchain technology will be recognized now, and he's questioning whether that will happen.
Well, blockchain definitely induces trust. And even pre-COVID, for the last 3 years, everything is wanting to be moved towards blockchain, because that's really a kind of unmutable or immutable timestamp and things like that, makes it trustworthy. So definitely that will get a fillip for sure.
Fantastic. So probably this may be the last question for the evening now. Dr. Kaustubh, can you sort of throw some light on, I mean, a common buzzword around is, as we move into a more digitalized platforms, more digitalized environment, digital transformation, there's a lot of mundane activities which are actually eventually going to be taken over by machines, which may do the same thing much more efficiently and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of talk about and concern also probably within the minds of a lot of people as to how they should reskill themselves. How do they unlearn, relearn, and sort of develop those new skills going forward? What are the areas where they should actually try to, where new opportunities actually may emerge in a practically like an explosion, wherein there will be multiple such opportunities where people can actually look at either diversifying themselves or adding those skills into what they do. So do you have any thoughts, anything that you would like to share around that?
Let's look at it in three different points. One is there is a fear of job loss, which will happen immediately. But I feel that a lot of bogies get raised about this. Let us look at history. When 45 years back, 50 years back, the IT revolution happened, almost everybody was saying that, oh, a lot of people will lose their jobs, etc., etc. But some people did lose, but people who reskilled definitely made it better. And it has not really, resulted in any massive job losses, etc. I go back 300 years back when the printing press was, invented. People must have raised the bogey that, calligraphers will lose their jobs. But, a whole new kind of industry comes in, and a whole new kind of requirement comes in. So I feel These job losses, yes, they happen, but they happen for a short period of time because the technological advances fuel some completely unthought of or unheard of industry or domains coming in. Now that's where the reskilling is required. So coming to the second part, one is people who really use their imagination and visualize use cases are going to be really in demand. That's for sure. Because we will, I mean, there is no precedent to this situation, right? So somebody with a fertile imagination will definitely be very much in demand. And then not just the imagination, but to form teams and to execute those things. So that's where the reskilling and the acquiring of new skill sets, machine learning, AI, architecture for AI. It's not just coding, but at the architecture level also there is a lot of, I mean, that's the basis of AI, right? Natural language processing, etc., etc. Has to be happening. IoT protocol creation, deployment of IoT, because a lot of real-time data is being captured already. Now that is going to really get into hyperdrive. So those are the kinds of careers, and those are the kind of skills that we need to look at from the execution part of it. Execution point of view. So people involved in execution need to reskill themselves from these perspectives. People involved in ideation, etc. That's the other side. So figure out the user journeys, changed user journeys, and figure out new use cases, test them, try them. So that's the kind of rapid, sort of iterative prototyping will have to get even faster. Is what I visualize, and that's where the job creation, skill creation, skill acquisition will have to be from.
Right. So maybe, in fact, as a follow-on question to that, since you brought up an interesting point over there, for the larger, I mean, India has a huge population of 1.3 billion people actually, and but the larger section of that population is actually still not very skilled, not very educated, will not probably fit into all the things that you probably said. So as a country, or as India, what do you think will happen going forward for these laborers? We are actually having a major issue with daily wages, actually facing some severe problems, and we have seen that during the last few weeks now.
Yeah.
And in relation to that, probably another very relevant question that Blessing has actually asked is, what sort of disruption do we expect to see in construction industry, which is obviously where a lot of daily wages and all of these relatively less skilled people or unskilled people are actually employed. So how do you see that pan out for the country, and what should India do to address that as a problem?
See, first of all, the paradigm of current account deficit or fiscal deficit will be thrown out for the time being, at least for the next 2 years. So a lot of stimulus is going to come into the economy, which will which will kind of, we will be pushed towards something like UBI, universal basic income, so to say. By force, things will happen, but the kind of resources that we have, we can't sustain that. The people's faith on the Chinese supply chain going down gives us a lot of opportunity for the manufacturing space. So jobs will be created there, even for unskilled people. That is going to happen. Then in the construction industry, because of the lack of demand, which already was there for the last 8-9 years, it will get exacerbated now with these times. So there will be a lot of cost cutting. There will be layoffs there, pretty sure. Automation will possibly come in there in terms of fabrication. 3D printing in that space will possibly get a fillip. I find it difficult for jobs to come in that space as they used to be earlier. That's my reading of the construction industry. I may be wrong, but that's my feeling.
Yeah, no, fair enough, absolutely. So I think with that, probably we'll close the session for today. Kaustubh, thanks a lot for your wonderful talk and also for answering the questions that we had online, as well as people were able to unmute themselves and ask verbally as well. So again, thanks a ton. I think we have learned a lot from today's session, and I hope you will be able to share the presentation copy also with us, so that then we can, if people are interested, we can distribute that subsequently.
I will mail it across to you.
Fabulous, no problem. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. I hope that you all have a safe evening. Enjoy the weekend, and hopefully we'll meet again pretty soon with another interesting edition of Tech Dice or Genesis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh.